A Yorkshire kitchen garden, late summer 1962, and the light is barely up when she begins, her hands pressing a fistful of grey wood ash into the soil around a struggling cabbage. No packet, no instruction, no label, just the weight of what she knows pressing back through her palms into the earth, and 22 other gestures just like this one running through her week, her season, her year, each one so embedded in the rhythm of this household that she performs them the way she breathes, without ceremony, without annotation, without the faintest idea that they are about to disappear. Because to understand how this was lost, you have to go back to the allotment plots of wartime Britain, to the women who ran them while the men were away, to the moment when deprivation accidentally produced a body of knowledge more effective, more sustainable, and more ecologically sound than anything that would replace it. And that is the central irony this film exists to recover. By 1943, an estimated 1.4 million new allotments had been cultivated across Britain under the Ministry of Agriculture's Dig for Victory campaign, and the women who managed them, women like those documented in Sheffield and Leeds health visitor records, feeding households of 5, 6, 7 people from plots averaging 250 square feet. Did so without chemical pesticides, without synthetic fertilizer, without bought compost, because rationing had stripped those options from the shelf, and what rationing stripped away, ingenuity quietly replaced, not through invention, but through the recovery of older soil knowledge that had been waiting in memory, passed between neighbors across garden fences, shared at Women's Institute meetings in church halls where a domestic science teacher might stand before 30 women and describe, without a single piece of paper, a complete system of biological gardening that worked. It worked every time, until the generation that knew why it worked was gone. Number 23 was the first gesture, and perhaps the oldest, wood ash scattered in a ring around brassicas, cabbages, sprouts, kale, on damp autumn mornings, the fine grey powder forming a barrier that slugs would not cross, whilst the potassium in the ash leached slowly into the soil and strengthened cell walls against disease, a trick so straightforward that it required nothing more than the residue of last night's fire and the memory of where to put it, yet so quietly effective that older women recalled finding it in their own mothers' habits, reaching back before the century turned. Number 22 arrived in spring. Nasturtiums sown at the edges of the kitchen garden, their round leaves and bright orange flowers not for beauty but for function, planted deliberately as sacrificial trap crops whose scent attracted blackfly and aphids away from the beans and brassicas they would otherwise destroy, the nasturtiums receiving the infestation, the vegetables escaping it, the whole transaction costing nothing and requiring no chemical intervention, just the decision to sacrifice one plant to save another, a decision that modern integrated pest management research would, decades later, formally endorse. Number 21 went deeper than the eye could see. Fish scraps, heads, bones, the contents of the gutting bowl, buried in the trench beneath the runner bean row in early spring, 6 inches down, where they would decompose slowly through the growing season, releasing nitrogen in the precise, sustained way that bean roots need, feeding the plant from below over weeks and months rather than in a single chemical hit, the soil around the trench becoming noticeably darker and more friable by the following year, a change that the women who dug it understood through their hands before they understood it through any explanation. Number 20 belonged to the kitchen as much as the garden, the cold water left after boiling potatoes, carried out in the same pot and poured directly around the seedling tray or the transplanted leek, the starch-based nutrients and residual minerals, in that water providing a mild but consistent feed that cost nothing because it was already there. A habit so quietly economical that it appeared in Women's Institute bulletins from 1946 through to the early 1950s before vanishing from the printed record entirely, surviving only in the notebooks of women who had thought to write their own household routines down, which was never enough of them. The knowledge was spreading in those post-war years, passing mouth to mouth, fence to fence, through the BBC Home Service's Woman's Hour garden segments that ran from 1946, through the WI's Home and Country Bulletin columns, through Allotment Society logbooks where seasonal observations accumulated alongside plot holder names, and here the second great irony enters the frame. The system worked so well, was executed so seamlessly by the women who held it, that it looked effortless, and because it looked effortless, no one thought it required documentation, and because no one documented it, when the women who held it aged and died, the knowledge aged and died with them. competence made invisible by its own success, mistaken for instinct when it was in fact expertise. Number 19 expressed that expertise in scent. Carrots and onions planted in alternating rows, their volatile compounds creating an olfactory confusion that disrupted the navigation of both carrot fly and onion fly, each pest thrown off course by the chemical signal of the other's host plant. The intervention costing 1 packet of seeds and requiring only the knowledge of why the rows should alternate rather than separate. Knowledge that was common in Wisconsin circles through the late 1940s, and had largely ceased to be transmitted by 1965. Number 18 worked through material. Old woolen rags cut from worn-out garments that would otherwise have been discarded, laid around the base of vulnerable plants in a loose ring, their lanolin residue, the natural oil still present in unwashed wool, repelling slugs and certain soil insects whilst the fibre itself retained moisture through dry spells. A dual function achieved by something that had already served its primary purpose and would otherwise have gone to the rag and bone man until he too stopped coming, and the rags went to the bin, and the plants went unprotected. Number 17 required caution and knowledge in equal measure. Rhubarb leaves, which are toxic and must never be eaten, boiled in water until the liquid turned dark, strained, cooled, and applied as a foliar spray against aphids and caterpillars, the oxalic acid in the solution acting as a natural insecticide whilst leaving no chemical residue on the edible parts of the plant beneath, a remedy that appeared in domestic science textbooks of the period and in at least one documented Women's Institute bulletin, effective enough to be forgotten only when the spray bottle from the garden shop made the whole business seem unnecessary. Number 16 was planted at every corner of the well-managed kitchen garden. French marigolds, their roots releasing thiophenies into the surrounding soil that suppressed nematode populations, their above-ground scent deterring whitefly, their function misread by later generations as purely decorative, as if the women who planted them had simply liked the color, when in fact they had planted them in the specific corners because that was where the wind moved the scent most effectively through the rows. A detail that takes practical observation to understand and a single season of neglect to lose. Number 15 required knowing which enemies each plant attracted. Leeks and celery grown in adjacent rows, each crop's volatile oils confusing the fly species that targeted the other, a mutual defense that produced better harvests of both vegetables than growing either alone, the logic of which was understood by any woman who had watched a garden through several seasons, but which left no trace in the record because it was never written in terms that the agricultural extension services of the period recognized as science. Number 14 took patience. A bucket or old tin filled with stinging nettles packed to the brim, covered with rainwater, and left to steep for 2 to 3 weeks in a corner of the garden, the resulting liquid, dark, strong-smelling, deeply unpleasant in the way that fertile things often are, diluted roughly 10 to 1, and fed to heavy-feeding crops like brassicas and courgettes, providing a high nitrogen liquid feed that cost nothing, required nothing beyond a bucket and time, and produced growth rates that would have been recognizable to any gardener who tried it until the branded liquid feed arrived on the Woolworths shelf in 1958, and the bucket in the corner began to seem like evidence of a poverty no longer necessary. Number 13 sat in the egg cup beside the cooker, crushed eggshells saved through the week in a small bowl, scattered in a ring around slug-vulnerable plants on damp evenings, the sharp edges deterring soft-bodied pests from crossing whilst the calcium in the shell leached into the soil over weeks and raised pH incrementally in acid patches, a trick requiring only that you keep the shells, which cost nothing because the eggs were already eaten, and that you remember to crush them, which required only habit, and habit requires transmission, and transmission requires that someone thinks to teach it, and by the early 1970s, no one was teaching it. Number 12 lived in the thumbnail, the practice of pinching out tomato lateral shoots, the side shoots that emerge in the joint between main stem and branch, using only the thumbnail, the slight resistance of the green growth against the nail, a sensory feedback that confirmed the shoot had been removed cleanly without wounding the plant. No knife needed, no scissors, no tool of any kind, just the knowledge of where to look and the physical memory of what clean removal feels like, and the tomato plants that were tended this way in British kitchen gardens and greenhouses through the 1950s produced fruit through September and into October, whilst untended plants bushed out, fruited late, and ripened rarely in the uncertain British summer. Number 11 was planted in October and forgotten until June. Garlic cloves pushed into the soil around the base of rose bushes in autumn, their sulfur compounds building slowly in the root zone through winter, emerging in the plant's sap by spring in concentrations that deterred the aphid colonies that would otherwise arrive in May and suppressed the fungal spores responsible for black spot, a companion planting practice documented in pre-war rose-growing guides and recalled by older women in Wisconsin oral history collections as something their mothers had done without question, until the systemic rose treatment in its bright tin arrived and made October garlic planting seem again like poverty. Number 10 was the structural backbone of everything, the strict 3-bed rotation of brassicas, root vegetables and legumes on a 3-year cycle, each crop family moving to a new bed each season in a sequence that starved soil-borne diseases of their preferred host, improved soil structure through the different root architectures of each family and built nitrogen through the legume year. A system that required no external inputs once established, that improved yields measurably over 3 and 5 and 10 years, and that was standard knowledge in allotment circles through the late 1940s and is now being rediscovered and formally validated by agricultural scientists who are finding it, to no one's surprise, except perhaps their own, exactly as effective as the women who practiced it always knew it to be. Then in the mid-1950s, the enemy arrived. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but on a shelf in Woolworths, in the form of a bottle with a label and a promise, and the daughters of the allotment women who picked it up were not doing anything wrong. They were doing what the marketing told them was progress, and what made it erasure rather than replacement was not the product, but the stigma that came with it, the quiet, cultural message that the old methods were the methods of poverty, and that poverty was something to be left behind, so that the women who still kept the nettle bucket and the eggshell bowl began to feel they were admitting to something, and the knowledge began to die not from neglect but from shame, which is faster and more complete. Number 9 required a trip to the ironmonger or the chemist for dried kelp, soaked overnight in a bucket of cold water, the resulting liquid strained and applied as a foliar spray or root drench, the iodine and trace minerals in the seaweed providing micronutrients that chemical fertilizers of the period did not contain and that plants growing in depleted post-war soils badly needed, a practice documented in WW1 gardening columns through the early 1950s and fading from the record by 1960, when the branded seaweed extract in its convenient bottle arrived, cost more, contained less, and required no knowledge of why you were using it. Number 8 came from the stocking drawer, old nylon stockings, past mending, cut into soft loops and used as plant ties for climbing beans and sweet peas trained up canes, the material stretching with the stem as it thickened, never cutting in the way that wire or string would, a trick that cost nothing and damaged nothing and required only that you kept the old stockings rather than throwing them away, which was itself a habit that required a certain relationship with material objects, a relationship that the convenience economy was actively eroding. Number 7 was heavy work, a half-barrel quantity of comfrey leaves dug into a trench the width of a spade and a foot deep before the potato sets went in, the leaves breaking down rapidly in the soil and releasing potassium in the form and at the depth where potato roots would find it most useful, producing heavier and more nutritious yields than the same plot treated with general-purpose fertilizer, a practice that required knowing what comfrey was and why it worked, that required having comfrey growing somewhere in or near the garden, and that required being willing to do heavy physical labor without the reassurance of a product label confirming you had done the right thing. Number 6 required nothing. On evenings when the forecast suggested frost and the seedlings were not yet established enough to risk it, newspaper folded into tents, 4 sides, no base, weighted at the corners with stones, placed over the young plants before dark, trapping enough warmth to see them through a mild frost, removed in the morning, folded and kept for the next cold night, a cold frame built from waste paper and stones that cost nothing, and worked well enough that the women who used it rarely lost seedlings to late frost until the rigid plastic cloche arrived in the garden center and the newspaper tent began to seem one final time like something that belonged to a harder past. Number 5 took place in February on a north-facing windowsill, Potato seed sets laid cut side down in empty egg boxes, the cool indirect light slowing the sprouting to produce short, dark, robust shoots rather than the pale etiolated growth that warm cupboards produced, the chitted sets going into the ground in March already vigorous, establishing faster and producing earlier harvests, the egg box costing nothing, and the principle requiring only the understanding that darkness and warmth together produce weakness, that cool and light together produce strength, an observation available to anyone who had paid attention to a potato through a single winter. Number 4 was a solution to the invisible problem. Parsnip seed, notoriously slow to germinate, taking 2 to 3 weeks to show itself whilst the soil crust forms and the row becomes indistinguishable from bare earth, sown alongside a small handful of radish seed. The radishes appearing in 5 to 8 days and marking the exact line of the parsnip row so that it could be kept clear, watered precisely and protected from accidental hoeing. The radishes harvested and eaten before the parsnips needed their space. 2 crops from 1 sowing, 0 waste. A trick so logical that it should have been written into every gardening manual and was instead passed between women across garden fences until the fences got higher and the gardens got smaller and the women inside them had less time to talk. By 1965, secondary school domestic science curricula in England and Wales had dropped kitchen garden rotation from their standard syllabus, and the National Allotment Society's records show the number of cultivated allotments falling from approximately 1.4 million in 1943 to under 500,000 by 1970. And the oral history collections held at the Museum of English Rural Life in Reading document women born between approximately 1935 and 1945 as the last generation to have learned this knowledge by watching rather than by reading. And by 1972, none of it was being transmitted through any formal educational channel in British state schools. It was simply ending, quietly, in the gap between 2 women's lifetimes, carried into old age by the generation that had practiced it, and not yet asked for by the generation that would one day need it. Number 3 happened in autumn, seed heads allowed to dry on the plant, runner beans left on the vine until the pods turned papery, leek flower heads dried on the stem until the black seeds were loose, lettuce allowed to bolt and be collected rather than pulled, saved in paper envelopes labelled in pencil, stored in the cool of the larder through winter, and replanted the following spring. The varieties adapted over years to the specific soil and climate of that particular garden, producing stronger germination and better yields than bought seed from a packet, at 0 cost, year after year. A practice that created a living archive of locally adapted plant varieties that died when the practice died, when the seed companies made saving seem unnecessary, when the seed packets arrived in their bright racks at the garden centre, and the envelopes in the larder began to seem once more like the evidence of a life people were trying to leave behind. Number 2 was built in layers: kitchen green waste, vegetable peelings, tea leaves, the outside leaves of cabbages, alternated with spent compost from last year's pots, autumn leaves raked from the garden path, and torn newspaper dampened before laying, each layer roughly 3 inches deep. The whole pile covered loosely and left, the internal temperature rising within 5 days to the point where the compost was actively cooking, producing finished material in 6 to 8 weeks without a proprietary activator, without a plastic bin, without anything beyond the materials already present in the cycle of the household. The garden feeding the kitchen, feeding the compost, feeding the garden in a loop that closed completely and cost nothing to run once it was running. Number 1 required no tool, no bucket, no seed, no ash, no scrap, no stocking, no newspaper, only hands and attention, reaching down into the bed and pressing damp soil between the fingers and the heel of the palm, rolling it, feeling for whether it formed a ribbon or crumbled, noting whether it held the warmth of recent sunshine or felt cold and inert, whether it smelled of something alive or something tired, whether the ribbon broke clean or tore in a way that suggested compaction. And from these readings, which took perhaps 15 seconds and required perhaps 15 years of practice to interpret correctly, knowing whether to plant, whether to wait, whether to water, whether to feed, the entire diagnostic performed without a testing kit, without a pH meter, without a digital sensor, just the accumulated knowledge of a body that had spent years pressing its hands into soil and paying attention to what the soil said back. That knowledge is gone. A new build garden, circa 1972, weed suppressant membrane laid flat across the border, a bag of proprietary slow-release granules open beside the path. Clean gravel between the raised beds, no nasturtiums at the corners, no ash ring around the brassicas, no marigolds at the edges, no woman bending to press soil between her fingers. The kitchen window above is lit. It is warm inside. Someone is home. But the garden does not know what it has lost, and neither does she. And the morning light falls on the gravel the same way it fell on the earth, and the earth is no longer listening.